The Bitterroot Valley in Montana lay cloaked in silence, its ancient pines burdened under a heavy blanket of snow. The world was a monochrome landscape of white and grey, the air sharp with winter's bite. In the middle of this wilderness, smoke curled from the chimney of Henry Lawson's cabin, a thin defiance against the icy expanse. At 61, Henry's face bore the marks of time and loss. Deep lines framed his eyes, and his once broad shoulders had stooped slightly, as though grief had carved away at him. 3 years had passed since he lost Margaret, his wife and partner in a shared mission of wildlife conservation. Together, they had built a sanctuary that was as much for people as it was for the injured animals they healed. Margaret had always said, "Every life deserves a second chance." Now those words lingered in Henry's mind like an echo in an empty room. After her death, the sanctuary had become unbearable, each corner haunted by her presence. Seeking solace, Henry retreated to his family's remote cabin, surrounded by wilderness but isolated from the world. Here, among the towering trees and endless snow, he found quiet, but not peace. Winter in the Bitterroot Valley was merciless, but Henry didn't mind. He welcomed the cold, the isolation, and the relentless rhythm of survival. It was a distraction from the ache in his chest that no amount of solitude could numb. Little did Henry know this winter would bring a chance to honor Margaret's legacy and reignite a spark he thought had long since died. Henry Lawson once lived a life brimming with purpose and love. He and Margaret had been partners in every sense of the word, their shared passion for wildlife bringing them together and driving their work. For years, they had operated the Lawson Wildlife Sanctuary, a place where injured and orphaned animals could find safety and healing. Their mission wasn't just about animals. It was about creating connections between humans, nature, and the fragile balance that tied them together. Margaret was the heart of the sanctuary. Her laughter filled the halls, her compassion inspired everyone who crossed their threshold, and her boundless optimism had often been the light guiding Henry through tough times. She believed in the goodness of the world, even when the darker edges of human behavior, poaching, neglect, and cruelty, threatened to dim that belief. Her death changed everything. Cancer had crept into their lives like an uninvited guest, stealing Margaret piece by piece. When she passed, Henry felt the world tilt, the anchor of his life torn away. The sanctuary, once a place of joy and purpose, became suffocating. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders of Margaret, the way she arranged blankets for the fawns, the hand-painted signs she had placed around the property, and the scent of her favorite tea lingering in the kitchen. Unable to bear the emptiness, Henry closed the sanctuary and retreated to his family's cabin in the Bitterroot Valley. It was a rugged, isolated place surrounded by 50 acres of untamed wilderness. It offered Henry what he thought he wanted: solitude. But solitude didn't heal the wounds. It only gave him time to dwell. He found himself sinking into a rhythm of routine, chopping wood, maintaining the cabin, and venturing out to check the land for signs of damage. Locals called him the hermit biologist, though a few still sought him out when their animals were in trouble, knowing his skills as a wildlife expert hadn't faded. Margaret's words haunted him. "Every life deserves a second chance, Henry." She'd said it so often, and now, in his loneliness, it felt like a challenge he couldn't meet. The wilderness was his solace, the unchanging cycle of nature his only companion. He believed his days of connection and purpose were behind him. Yet, deep in his heart, a flicker of who he had once been remained. And in the relentless silence of that harsh winter, fate was about to call him back to life. The snowstorm had rolled in faster than Henry anticipated. The sky, a pale grey that morning, now swirled with thick flakes, obscuring the view of the pines that stood sentry around his cabin. Wrapped in a thick coat and scarf, Henry ventured out for his daily property check, the cold air stinging his face as his boots crunched through the deep snow. The cabin sat on 50 acres of land, a mix of dense forest and open clearings. The property bordered Henderson Creek, a narrow, winding stream that was mostly frozen over during the harsh winter months. It had been a ritual for Henry to check the creek and surrounding terrain for signs of fallen trees or animal tracks. In the solitude of winter, these small tasks anchored his days. As he approached the creek, a sound stopped him in his tracks, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. He froze, listening intently. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. It was a sound Henry had heard many times during his career, a cry of pain, fear, and desperation. Following the sound, Henry moved cautiously along the ravine that bordered the creek. The snow underfoot was treacherous, hiding icy patches and uneven ground. The growl grew louder, more distinct, accompanied by a metallic scraping noise that made his stomach turn. He knew what it was before he even saw it. Peering over the edge of the ravine, Henry's breath caught. There, partially obscured by snow and shadow, was a massive black bear, her dark fur a stark contrast against the white landscape. She was trapped in a steel leg-hold trap, her right hind leg caught in its cruel jaws. Blood stained the snow around her as she struggled weakly, her strength waning. Henry's heart sank. Illegal traps like this had no place in the wilderness. They were barbaric, outlawed in many areas, yet still used by poachers who cared little for the suffering they caused. The bear's size and swollen belly told Henry she was pregnant, close to giving birth. The storm was worsening and the bear's time was running out. The cubs she carried would not survive without her. Logic told Henry to turn back, to call Fish and Wildlife Services and wait for their help. But his heart knew better. Margaret's voice echoed in his mind. Every life deserves a second chance. He had to act. The bear's dark eyes locked onto Henry as he descended the ravine's slippery slope. Her growl grew louder, low and menacing, despite the obvious pain she was in. She struggled against the trap, her massive body shifting with labored effort, but she was too weak to mount any real threat. "Easy now," Henry murmured, his voice soft but steady, the way he used to calm injured animals in the sanctuary. "I'm here to help you." Reaching the base of the ravine, Henry stopped a safe distance away, assessing the situation. The trap's rusted teeth had bitten deep into the bear's hind leg, the wound bleeding sluggishly in the freezing cold. Every movement she made seemed to drain her strength further. Her breathing was heavy, labored, and her swollen belly rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. Henry slipped the tranquilizer gun off his shoulder. It was an old tool from his sanctuary days, one he carried on property checks more out of habit than necessity. He quickly loaded a dose calibrated for large mammals, hoping it would be enough to sedate her without harming the cubs she carried. The bear growled again, baring her teeth as he raised the gun. "I know you're scared," Henry said, his voice calm. "But I need you to trust me." He fired, the dart finding its mark in her shoulder. The bear roared, thrashing weakly before her movement slowed, her growls fading into a labored silence. After a few minutes, her massive body slumped into the snow, her breathing shallow but steady. Henry moved quickly. The wind was picking up, driving snow into his face and freezing his exposed fingers as he crouched beside the trap. It was old but well made, its heavy steel jaws frozen solid in the bitter cold. His first attempt to pry it open failed, the metal unyielding beneath his gloves. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling a crowbar from his pack. His muscles strained as he forced the jaws apart, the sound of creaking metal cutting through the howling wind. Finally, with a loud snap, the trap released. Henry examined the bear's leg. The wound was deep, but no arteries appeared severed. Working swiftly, he cleaned the gash with antiseptic and wrapped it in gauze, his numb fingers fumbling with the bandage. As he finished, the bear stirred. Henry's heart raced as her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. There was no anger in her gaze, only exhaustion, and something else. Understanding. Henry backed away, his hands trembling, as the bear began to rise unsteadily. Her gaze lingered on him before she turned, limping toward the forest and vanishing into the swirling snow. He stood there, stunned and shivering, before the pain in his head reminded him of his fall on the icy slope. Blood trickled down his temple, and the world tilted. He stumbled back up the ravine, barely making it to his cabin before collapsing. The storm raged on outside, but in his heart a spark of something long buried stirred. Hope. Henry awoke the next morning with a pounding headache and a vague sense of disorientation. The events of the previous day came rushing back as he touched the dried blood on his temple. He'd managed to bandage his wound before collapsing into bed, but his body ached from the effort of the rescue and his tumble on the icy slope. He rose carefully, peering out the frost-covered window. The storm had passed, leaving the valley blanketed in fresh snow, its pristine surface unbroken. The sight was beautiful, serene, but Henry's mind was elsewhere. The bear. Did she make it? Was she alive? He replayed the moment when her eyes met his, the raw exhaustion in her gaze mingling with something he couldn't fully name. Gratitude? Recognition? Or was it his own imagination, a desperate need to feel that his actions had mattered? Henry bundled up and ventured outside. The cold was biting, but his worry outweighed the discomfort. He made his way back to the ravine, careful to avoid the icy patches that had betrayed him the day before. The site of the trap was easy to find. The disturbed snow, flecks of blood, and discarded gauze marked where he'd freed her. But she was gone. Only faint tracks led away from the spot, her limping gait evident in the uneven impressions. The tracks disappeared into the dense forest beyond, swallowed by the trees and fresh snowfall. Henry knelt by the disturbed snow, his breath fogging in the cold air. He whispered into the silence, "I hope you made it, Mama. I hope your cubs made it too." Returning to his cabin, Henry couldn't shake the memory of her gaze. He spent the rest of the day tending to his wound and replaying the rescue in his mind, wondering if he had done enough. He knew the odds were against her, pregnant, injured, and facing the harshest part of winter. But he clung to a glimmer of hope. Days turned into weeks, and the bear never reappeared. Henry often found himself looking toward the forest, scanning the snow for tracks or signs of life. But the wilderness remained quiet. He began to doubt the connection he'd felt in that fleeting moment after the rescue. Perhaps it was just his grief talking, his mind projecting onto the bear the emotions he couldn't fully process. Yet, as the snow began to melt and hints of spring appeared in the valley, Henry found a small shift within himself. For the first time in years, he felt something more than sorrow. He felt purpose. Whether or not the bear survived, her presence had reignited a part of him that had lain dormant since Margaret's passing. He didn't fully understand it yet, but the memory of her eyes, steady, trusting, lingered, a spark in the cold darkness of his solitude. As spring crept into the Bitterroot Valley, the snow began to retreat, revealing patches of green and the first brave wildflowers pushing through the thawing ground. The icy creek Henry had checked every day now flowed freely, its soft murmur a welcome reprieve from the silence of winter. But even as the world around him came to life, Henry found his thoughts drifting to the bear he'd rescued. Had she survived? Did her cubs make it? The questions followed him like shadows, surfacing during quiet moments on the porch or when he walked the trails near his cabin. He searched for signs of her, examining tracks in the soft earth and watching the edges of the forest for movement. But she remained a ghost. Henry kept busy, throwing himself into the routines of spring. Locals had started bringing him injured animals again, a young fox with a broken leg, an eagle with a damaged wing. Word of his expertise had spread, and though he welcomed the work, he kept his interactions brief, preferring to avoid lingering conversations. Yet, each animal he helped felt like a small nod to Margaret's legacy. Her words echoed in his mind. Every life deserves a second chance. One afternoon in late April, Henry was repairing a section of his fence when a farmer named Dave Larson arrived unannounced, a pair of goats in tow. One had a deep gash on its side, likely from barbed wire. "Heard you're still the best around for this sort of thing," Dave said, a hint of sheepishness in his tone. Henry nodded, gesturing for Dave to bring the animals closer. As he cleaned and stitched the wound, Dave struck up a conversation. "Folks were talking about tracks out near the Henderson Creek Trail," he said. "Big ones, bear-sized." Henry's hands paused for a moment before continuing. "There are plenty of bears around here," he replied, keeping his voice even. "Sure," Dave said, "but this one's been spotted a few times, limping. Could be the one you helped last winter." The word sent a ripple of hope through Henry, though he tried to temper it. "Could be," he said quietly. After Dave left, Henry found himself walking the trails near Henderson Creek more often, scanning for tracks or other signs. Though he never found her, the possibility that she was alive and raising her cubs in the vast wilderness gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The bear had changed something in Henry. Her struggle, her will to survive. It mirrored his own journey through grief. She had reminded him of the value of persistence, of small acts of care that could ripple outward in ways he might never fully understand. By the time summer arrived, Henry had settled into a quiet rhythm. He took in more animals, started fixing up parts of his property, and began to see his isolation not as an escape, but as a space for renewal. And though the bear remained out of sight, she was never far from his thoughts. The first warm days of spring had settled over the Bitterroot Valley, and the forest was alive with the sounds of returning life. Birds sang from the budding trees, squirrels chattered in the underbrush, and the once frozen creek now flowed freely, its waters glinting under the golden sunlight. Henry stood in his garden, turning the soil for planting, the rhythm of the work grounding him. The soft hum of the wilderness was suddenly interrupted by a low, guttural sound. It wasn't the sharp bark of a fox or the chittering of a raccoon. No, this sound was deeper, more resonant, familiar. Henry froze, the trowel slipping from his hand. Slowly he turned toward the edge of the forest. There, framed by the towering pines, stood a massive black bear. For a moment his breath caught in his chest. It was her. He would recognize her anywhere, the slight limp in her hind leg, the faint scar that marked where the trap had gripped her flesh. But she wasn't alone. Two nearly grown cubs emerged from the shadows, their sleek black coats gleaming in the sunlight. They bounded playfully behind their mother, their youthful energy a sharp contrast to her measured movements. Henry's heart swelled at the sight, a lump forming in his throat. The bear stood still, her intelligent eyes locking onto Henry's. It was the same gaze he had seen that day in the ravine, wary yet knowing. She huffed softly, a sound that seemed less threatening and more like acknowledgement. Henry didn't move. He knew better than to approach, knew that maintaining her trust meant respecting her wildness. Instead, he stood quietly, his hands at his sides, letting her take the lead. The cubs, curious and unafraid, wrestled in the grass while their mother watched Henry intently. For nearly 10 minutes, the two of them remained like that, a respectful distance apart, bound by an unspoken connection. Henry didn't speak. He didn't need to. The bear's return, her survival, and the sight of her thriving cubs spoke volumes. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the bear turned and nudged her cubs toward the forest. They obeyed, their playful antics giving way to cautious steps as they disappeared into the trees. But before she followed, the bear looked back at Henry one last time, her gaze lingering as if to say, "I remember." When she was gone, Henry stood in the quiet clearing, the sounds of the forest slowly returning. Tears filled his eyes, unbidden but welcome. For the first time in years, he felt a deep and undeniable joy, a reminder that life, no matter how fragile, had a way of enduring against the odds. The bear and her cubs had survived, and they had come back to him. It was more than a reunion. It was a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and the connections that could be forged even in the wildest corners of the world. In the weeks following the bear's return, Henry couldn't shake the image of her and her cubs from his mind. The encounter had rekindled something in him, a sense of wonder and connection that had been dulled by years of grief and solitude. It wasn't just the fact that she had survived. It was the trust she'd shown by coming back, the way she'd stood at the edge of his garden as if acknowledging the bond they shared. It wasn't long before the bear and her cubs became regular visitors. Every few days, Henry would catch sight of them near the creek or at the forest's edge. The cubs, curious and playful, often ventured closer than their mother, tumbling through the grass or sniffing the air toward the cabin. Their mother remained watchful, her movements deliberate, always keeping an eye on her mischievous offspring and on Henry. Henry respected their boundaries, careful not to overstep. He left small offerings at the forest's edge, fish from the creek, berries he foraged, and occasionally honeycomb from a nearby apiary. It wasn't much, but it felt like a way to give back for the gift they had unknowingly given him, a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Henry sat on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee. The bear family appeared at the tree line, their dark forms silhouetted against the golden light. The cubs romped in the open field while their mother sat quietly, her gaze fixed on Henry. He raised his mug in a silent toast, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're welcome here, as long as you want to be," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping she felt the sentiment. The visits became a part of Henry's routine. Each time they appeared, he watched with quiet awe, marveling at the bond that seemed to grow stronger with each encounter. The bear, for her part, never came too close, maintaining the respectful distance of a wild creature. Yet, her steady presence brought Henry a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, he caught himself talking to Margaret's photograph on the mantel, his voice tinged with both sadness and gratitude. "You'd have loved this, Maggie," he said. "She's incredible. They all are. You always said every life deserves a second chance, and you were right." In saving the bear, Henry had unknowingly saved himself. Their bond was a reminder that even in the face of loss, life had a way of continuing, wild, unpredictable, and full of quiet beauty. As the bear and her cubs continued to visit, word spread through the Bitterroot Valley about Henry Lawson and his remarkable bond with the wild creatures. Locals who had once dismissed him as a recluse began to see him in a different light. Farmers, hikers, and even wildlife enthusiasts shared stories of catching glimpses of the bear family near Henry's cabin, their respect for him growing with each tale. One day, a knock on his door broke the usual rhythm of his quiet mornings. Henry opened it to find a woman with a camera slung over her shoulder and a notebook tucked under her arm. "Mr. Lawson?" she asked, her voice careful, as if wary of intruding. "I'm Sophie Grant. I'm a wildlife photographer and writer. I've heard about your connection with the bear and her cubs, and I'd love to document it." Henry hesitated. He wasn't one for publicity and had chosen the wilderness precisely to avoid attention. But there was something about Sophie's earnestness, the way she spoke about educating people on the importance of wildlife conservation, that softened his resistance. "It's not much of a story," he replied gruffly, stepping aside to let her in. "I just did what anyone should do." Over the following weeks, Sophie spent time at Henry's cabin, learning his story and observing the bears from a distance. She was careful to respect the boundary Henry had established with the animals, using her long lens to capture their interactions without disturbing them. Her photographs were breathtaking, intimate moments of the cubs playing near the creek, their mother's watchful gaze fixed on Henry's cabin, and the quiet grace of their bond. The article Sophie eventually published, "The Hermit and the Bear," went beyond just their story. It shed light on the broader issues of illegal trapping, habitat destruction, and the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. Henry's reluctant role as the story's protagonist brought attention to the plight of black bears and other vulnerable species. To Henry's surprise, the piece resonated deeply with readers. Donations poured into local conservation efforts, and wildlife organizations reached out to collaborate with him. Henry found himself speaking at small community events, sharing his experience and advocating for stricter wildlife protection laws. Though he preferred the quiet of his cabin, he recognized the opportunity to honor Margaret's legacy through this newfound platform. The bear and her cubs became symbols of resilience and trust, their story inspiring a renewed appreciation for the wild spaces of Montana. Henry, once isolated in his grief, found himself surrounded by people who shared his passion for protecting the creatures that called the Bitterroot Valley home. Through it all, the bear family continued to visit, their presence a reminder of what had brought him back to life. Their story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of compassion to bridge the divide between man and nature. The seasons turned as they always did, and the bear family's visits grew less frequent. The cubs, now nearly full-grown, began to explore on their own, their confidence and independence evident in the way they roamed the forest. Henry watched from his porch as they ventured further each time, their mother allowing them the space to grow while keeping a watchful eye from the shadows. Henry had come to expect these changes. He had spent a lifetime working with wildlife and understood that nature followed its own rhythm. Yet each time the bear family visited, he felt the fleeting nature of their bond acutely. They were wild creatures, and their place was in the forest, not tied to his small corner of it. Still, he cherished every moment they shared, knowing their connection had already given him more than he could have hoped for. One crisp spring morning, as the frost melted under the rising sun, Henry heard a familiar low growl near the edge of his property. Setting down his coffee, he stepped outside and saw her, the mother bear, standing at the tree line. She had returned, but this time she wasn't alone. Two tiny cubs tumbled clumsily at her feet, their fur shiny and soft, their movements unsteady. Behind her, at a respectful distance, stood her nearly grown cubs, watching their mother and the new additions to their family with quiet curiosity. Henry's breath caught. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of the bear's new cubs, a testament to her resilience and survival. He stood still, hands at his sides, letting her decide the terms of their interaction. She watched him with the same steady gaze he had come to know so well, her new cubs wobbling in the grass as they explored their surroundings. For a long moment, the bear stayed there, her presence calm and deliberate. Then, as if offering one last acknowledgement, she huffed softly and turned toward the forest. Her older cubs followed, and after a bit of coaxing, the youngest ones did too. Henry felt his throat tighten as he watched them disappear into the trees. He knew, deep down, that this might be the last time he saw her. The bear had fulfilled her role, raising not just one generation of cubs, but now beginning another. Her visits had given him something he hadn't thought possible: healing, hope, and a reminder that life carried on. Though she left without fanfare, Henry stood there long after she was gone, the morning light filtering through the trees. He whispered softly into the stillness, "Thank you, Mama Bear." As the forest returned to its quiet hum, Henry realized that their farewell wasn't an end. It was a continuation of life, of Margaret's legacy, and of the deep connection between humanity and the wild. He felt at peace, knowing the bond they had shared would linger, imprinted on his heart like the tracks the bear had left behind. The morning of the bear's farewell stayed with Henry long after she disappeared into the forest. Her return with new cubs was a testament to her strength, resilience, and the power of their shared connection. Though he suspected it was the last time he would see her, he didn't feel sadness, only gratitude. The bear had not only survived but thrived, and in doing so, she had brought Henry back to life in ways he never could have imagined. With spring fully in bloom, Henry returned to his work with renewed energy. The visitors who once saw him as a reclusive hermit now sought him out for his wisdom and expertise. He began transforming his property into a wildlife rehabilitation center, something Margaret had dreamed of doing before her illness. Naming it the Lawson Wildlife Sanctuary in her honor, Henry expanded his efforts to provide care for injured and orphaned animals, much like the sanctuary they had once run together. The sanctuary quickly became a cornerstone of the community. Locals volunteered their time, bringing supplies and assisting with the animals. Farmers, once skeptical of his passion for wildlife, brought him creatures in need of help. A fawn found alone after a storm, a hawk with an injured wing, and even a young coyote entangled in barbed wire. Each life saved felt like a small act of defiance against the darkness that had once consumed him. Henry's story, thanks to Sophie's article and photographs, gained attention far beyond the Bitterroot Valley. Conservation organizations reached out to collaborate, offering grants and resources to support his work. Schools brought children to visit the sanctuary, teaching them about the importance of protecting Montana's wildlife. Among the displays was a rusted steel trap, a stark reminder of the bear's story and the broader need to fight against illegal poaching and harmful practices. Though Henry's days were busier than they'd been in years, he always made time for quiet moments. On warm evenings, he would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, gazing at the forest's edge where the bear had once appeared. In those moments, he often spoke to Margaret's photograph, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and joy. "We did it, Maggie," he would say. "She survived. She gave her cubs a chance, and now we're giving these animals one too. You'd have loved seeing this." The sanctuary continued to grow, drawing visitors and volunteers from across the state. Yet, Henry remained grounded in the simplicity of his mission: to care for the creatures that needed him, to honor Margaret's legacy, and to nurture the bond between humanity and the wild. Years later, on a quiet spring morning, Henry received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, barely out of college, arrived at the sanctuary with a notebook in hand. She introduced herself as Emma, a biology student inspired by Sophie's article and the sanctuary's story. "I want to help," she said earnestly. "I want to learn how to do what you do." Henry smiled, seeing a spark of Margaret's determination in her eyes. He agreed to mentor her, sharing his knowledge and passion for wildlife. With her help, the sanctuary thrived, ensuring its mission would continue long after Henry's time. One day, while walking along the creek with Emma, Henry paused near the spot where he had first found the bear. The ravine had grown over with wildflowers, the trap long gone but its memory etched into the land. "Every life deserves a second chance," Henry said softly, echoing Margaret's words. "She taught me that, and I think she knew I needed one too." Emma looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "She gave you that, didn't she?" "The bear." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She did, and through her, I found my way back to what matters." As the years passed, the sanctuary became Henry's legacy, a place where his love for Margaret and his connection to the bear were woven into every act of kindness. Though he never saw the bear again, he knew she was out there, her descendants roaming the wild mountains and valleys of Montana. And each time he heard the rustle of leaves or the distant call of an animal, Henry felt her presence, wild, enduring, and forever a part of his story. In saving the bear's life, Henry had found his own second chance. Through her, he learned that healing wasn't about erasing pain, but embracing the connections that reminded him of life's beauty. And in honoring her, he honored the memory of the woman who had taught him to see that beauty in the first place.